The heavy oak doors of Courtroom 237 in the Los Angeles County Superior Court creaked open with an ominous sound that made 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez freeze in her tracks. Her small fingers tightened around her worn teddy bear, Mr. Buttons, whose once bright brown fur had been dulled by countless nights of desperate hugging and tear-soaked embraces. The courtroom stretched before her like a vast canyon, filled with rows of wooden benches, packed with strangers whose eyes seemed to burn into her tiny frame. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs, so hard she was certain everyone could hear it echoing through the silent chamber. She hadn't spoken a single word in 6 months, not since that night when her world exploded into violence and terror. The doctors had tried everything. Therapy sessions with colorful toys, gentle counselors with kind voices, even medication to help calm her racing thoughts. Nothing worked. The words were trapped somewhere deep inside her, locked away behind walls of trauma that seemed impossible to break. Beside her, moving with the grace and dignity of a trained professional, walked Max, a magnificent golden retriever whose coat shimmered like spun gold in the harsh fluorescent lighting. His dark, intelligent eyes surveyed the courtroom with calm assessment, completely unfazed by the crowd of journalists, lawyers, and curious onlookers who had packed the gallery. Max's presence was the only thing standing between Emma and complete panic. When the nightmares came in the middle of the night, when the flashbacks hit during the day, when the world became too loud and too bright and too scary, Max was always there, a steady, breathing anchor in her storm-tossed life. At the defendant's table, 3 men sat in expensive suits that couldn't quite hide their predatory nature. Marcus Webb, a tall man with cold blue eyes and prematurely gray hair, leaned back in his chair with an arrogant smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Tony Martinez, stocky and dangerous-looking, despite his lawyer's attempts to clean him up, drummed his fingers impatiently on the table. Jake Coleman, the youngest of the 3, kept shooting nervous glances toward Emma, his leg bouncing anxiously under the table. They had good reason to be confident. What could a traumatized child who couldn't speak possibly do to hurt their carefully constructed defense? Judge Patricia Williams, a stern woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, surveyed her courtroom with the authority of someone who had seen every possible drama unfold within these walls. She had presided over murder cases, gang trials, and high-profile celebrity scandals, but nothing quite like this. When the prosecution had first requested permission to bring a therapy dog into her courtroom, she had been skeptical. Dogs belonged in parks and homes, not in the hallowed halls of justice. But the more she learned about Emma's case, the more her perspective began to shift. The defense attorney, Robert Sterling, was a shark in a $3,000 suit. His reputation for getting violent criminals acquitted was legendary in Los Angeles legal circles. He had built his career on finding technicalities, exploiting loopholes, and destroying the credibility of witnesses, especially vulnerable ones like children. As Emma entered with Max, Sterling's eyes lit up with predatory glee. He saw opportunity in her silence, weakness in her trauma. He was already planning his opening argument. How could the court possibly trust the testimony of a child so damaged she couldn't even speak? It would be like taking candy from a baby. "Your Honor," Sterling practically shouted as he shot to his feet, his voice dripping with theatrical indignation. "This is absolutely ridiculous. A dog has no place in a court of law. This is nothing more than a cheap emotional ploy designed to manipulate the jury. We're supposed to be seeking justice, not running a 3-ring circus." His words echoed through the chamber, causing several jurors to shift uncomfortably in their seats. But prosecutor Amanda Foster had spent months preparing for this moment. A veteran of the district attorney's office with over 15 years of experience putting dangerous criminals behind bars, she knew this case was different. This wasn't just about getting a conviction. It was about giving a voice to a child who had been silenced by unspeakable trauma. She had consulted with child psychologists, animal behavior experts, and legal scholars from across the country. What they were attempting had never been done before in a California courtroom, possibly anywhere in the United States. Emma's mother, Maria Rodriguez, sat in the front row of the gallery, her face a mask of barely controlled emotion. Dark circles under her eyes told the story of 6 months of sleepless nights, of watching her vibrant, chatty little girl retreat into a world of silence. Maria's husband, Detective Miguel Rodriguez, should have been sitting beside her, but he was still confined to a wheelchair, his body slowly healing from the brutal beating that had nearly cost him his life. The doctors said he was lucky to be alive. Emma had seen it all. As Emma slowly made her way toward the witness stand, her small shoes making soft clicking sounds on the polished marble floor, Max maintained perfect position beside her. His training was evident in every step, head held high, ears alert but relaxed, his entire focus centered on the small girl who needed him more than she had ever needed anyone. The dog had been specially trained by the nonprofit organization Courthouse Dogs, one of only a handful of facilities in the country that prepared animals for this incredibly specialized work. Judge Williams banged her gavel once, the sharp crack cutting through the tension like a knife. "Mr. Sterling, you will sit down and remain quiet until I ask for your input. This court has already ruled on the admissibility of the therapy animal, and that ruling stands." Her voice carried the weight of absolute authority, honed by decades on the bench. Emma reached the witness stand and looked up at the imposing chair that seemed designed for adults, not frightened children. Max sat beside her without being commanded, his warm presence radiating calm and safety. The courtroom fell silent. Hundreds of pairs of eyes focused on this tiny girl and her canine guardian. Nobody knew that Emma and Max shared a secret weapon, something no one fully understood, not even the experts who had brought them together. Judge Williams leaned forward slightly, her stern expression softening as she looked at Emma. "Are you ready to begin, sweetheart?" Emma's response would shock everyone present and change the course of American legal history forever. Detective Miguel Rodriguez should have gone home hours ago. The digital clock on his desk glowed 11:47 p.m. in angry red numbers, mocking his promise to Maria that he'd be home by dinner. The precinct was nearly empty, except for the skeleton night crew, their distant conversations echoing through the fluorescent-lit hallways like whispers from another world. Miguel rubbed his tired eyes and looked again at the case files spread across his desk. Photos of drug busts, surveillance reports, and witness statements that painted a picture of the most dangerous trafficking operation Los Angeles had seen in years. The Viper Ring, as they dubbed it, wasn't just moving drugs through the city. They were bringing in military-grade weapons, corrupting city officials, and leaving a trail of bodies in their wake. Miguel had been working this case for 8 months, slowly building an airtight prosecution that would put the leaders away for life. He had no idea that his dedication to justice had made him a target, or that 3 of the most dangerous men in the city had been watching his house for weeks. At home, 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez was supposed to be fast asleep in her princess-themed bedroom, surrounded by stuffed animals and fairy tale books. Her mother, Maria, had tucked her in hours ago, after reading 3 bedtime stories. Emma always demanded exactly 3, and kissing her forehead with a gentle ritual they'd shared since Emma was a baby. "Daddy's working late again, Mia," Maria had whispered, smoothing Emma's dark hair. "But he'll be here when you wake up." It was a promise that would haunt Maria for months to come. But Emma couldn't sleep. She never could when Daddy worked late, because she worried about the bad guys he chased. At 8 years old, she understood more about her father's dangerous job than her parents realized. She had heard the hushed conversations, seen the concern in her mother's eyes, felt the tension that crept into their home whenever Miguel worked a big case. So instead of sleeping, Emma sat by her bedroom window, watching the street for her father's familiar patrol car, hoping to see his headlights turn into their driveway. That's when she saw them. 3 shadows moving across their front lawn, dressed in black and moving with the predatory stealth of wolves hunting prey. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she watched the men approach their house. Even at 8, she knew this wasn't normal. Visitors didn't creep through shadows at midnight. They didn't wear masks that covered their faces. They didn't carry baseball bats and crowbars like the men she could barely make out in the darkness below. Marcus Webb was the leader, his cold intelligence evident even behind the black ski mask that concealed his features. He had spent weeks planning this operation, studying Miguel Rodriguez's schedule, learning his family's routines. The detective had gotten too close to their operation, seized too much of their product, identified too many of their suppliers. Webb's instructions from the organization were clear. Send a message that would make Rodriguez back off, or eliminate him entirely if necessary. Tony Martinez flanked Webb's left side, his stocky frame coiled with violent energy. This wasn't his first home invasion, and the anticipation of violence made his pulse quicken with sick excitement. In his hands, he gripped a Louisville Slugger baseball bat, its wooden surface scarred from previous jobs. Martinez was the muscle of the operation, the one they called when subtlety was no longer an option. Jake Coleman brought up the rear, younger than the others, and visibly nervous despite his attempts to appear tough. This was only his second job with the Viper ring, and the idea of breaking into a cop's house made his stomach churn with anxiety. But backing out now would mean becoming their next target, and Coleman had seen what happened to people who disappointed Marcus Webb. Emma watched in frozen terror as Webb produced something from his jacket. Lock, picking tools that gleamed silver in the moonlight. Within seconds, the front door of her home clicked open with barely a whisper. The security system should have activated, but Webb had done his homework. A corrupt contact at the security company had provided the disarm codes weeks ago. The Rodriguez family was defenseless, and they didn't even know it. The little girl pressed herself against her bedroom window, her small hands leaving foggy prints on the glass as panic overwhelmed her 8-year-old mind. She should run to her parents' room. She should scream. She should call 911, but fear had paralyzed her completely, turning her legs to jelly and stealing her voice. All she could do was watch as the 3 intruders disappeared into her house like nightmares coming to life. Downstairs, Maria Rodriguez was jolted awake by a sound she couldn't quite identify, a soft thump followed by muffled footsteps. Her maternal instincts screamed danger as she sat up in bed, straining to listen. Miguel wasn't due home for hours, and Emma was a quiet sleeper. The sounds were coming from the living room, deliberate and stealthy. Someone was in their house. Maria's hand flew to the bedside table where Miguel kept his backup service weapon, but the drawer was empty. He had taken it to the precinct for maintenance the week before. Her cell phone was downstairs in the kitchen, charging overnight as always. She was trapped, defenseless, with her daughter somewhere in the house and 3 armed intruders moving through their home like predators stalking prey. The attack, when it came, was swift and brutal. Webb and his men had expected to find Detective Rodriguez asleep in his bed, vulnerable and easy to intimidate. Instead, they found Maria trying to barricade herself in the bedroom while frantically searching for anything she could use as a weapon. When she saw the masked figures burst through the door, Maria's scream of terror echoed through the house like a siren, a sound that would replay in Emma's nightmares for months to come. From her hiding spot at the top of the stairs, Emma watched her mother being dragged into the living room by men whose faces were hidden behind masks that made them look like monsters from her worst dreams. She watched them destroy her family's furniture, demanding to know where her father kept his case files. She saw her mother's tears, heard her desperate pleas, felt her own world crumbling as violence invaded the safe haven that had always protected her. When Miguel Rodriguez finally arrived home at 2:15 a.m., he found his front door ajar and his house in shambles. The nightmare had only just begun. The sterile white walls of Children's Hospital Los Angeles felt like prison bars to 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez. 3 weeks had passed since the attack, and she hadn't spoken a single word. She sat motionless in the corner of her hospital room, knees drawn to her chest, dark eyes staring at nothing, while her mind replayed the nightmare over and over like a broken movie projector. Her father lay in intensive care 2 floors below, fighting for his life after the brutal beating that had left him with a traumatic brain injury, 3 broken ribs, and internal bleeding that nearly killed him. Dr. Sarah Chun had seen many traumatized children during her 15 years as a pediatric psychologist, but Emma's case was unlike anything in her experience. The child's silence wasn't just selective mutism. It was a complete retreat from the world of human communication. Traditional therapy techniques had failed completely. Emma wouldn't respond to gentle questioning, art therapy, or even play-based interventions. She existed in a bubble of terror that no adult seemed capable of penetrating. She's protecting herself the only way she knows how, Dr. Chun explained to Maria Rodriguez during one of their daily consultations. Emma witnessed something so traumatic that her mind has essentially shut down all verbal communication as a survival mechanism. Speaking means being vulnerable, and vulnerability means danger in her world now. Maria's own trauma was evident in the dark circles under her eyes and the way her hands shook when she held her coffee cup. She had spent every waking moment at the hospital, dividing her time between Emma's bedside and her husband's ICU room. But will she ever speak again? Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Will my little girl ever be my little girl again? Dr. Chun had been asking herself the same question when inspiration struck during a late-night research session. She had read about an experimental program at the University of Washington where specially trained therapy dogs were being used to help traumatized children find their voices again. The results were promising, but the program was still in its infancy. Only a handful of dogs nationwide had received the intensive training required for this type of specialized work. That's when she learned about Max. Maxwell, his full registered name, was a 2-year-old golden retriever who had graduated from the most elite canine training facility in America, the Canine Companions for Courage program in Northern California. Unlike typical therapy dogs who provided comfort through presence and affection, Max had been trained in what experts called facilitated communication, the ability to serve as a bridge between traumatized individuals and the outside world. Max's training had begun when he was just 8 weeks old, carefully selected from a litter based on his exceptional intelligence, emotional sensitivity, and calm temperament. For 18 months, he had worked with child psychologists, trauma specialists, and master dog trainers to develop skills that bordered on the miraculous. He could recognize over 50 different hand signals, respond to emotional states that humans couldn't detect, and most remarkably, he seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of human trauma that defied scientific explanation. When Dr. Chun first contacted Max's handler, Beth Williams, she was skeptical about whether the program would work for a child as severely traumatized as Emma. We've never dealt with a case involving such extreme violence witnessed by someone so young, Beth explained during their phone consultation. But Max has shown remarkable ability to connect with children who've given up on connecting with people. If anyone can reach your patient, it's him. The day Max first entered Emma's hospital room, something extraordinary happened. The little girl who had shown no reaction to doctors, nurses, therapy animals, or even her own mother's tears, slowly lifted her head and looked directly at the golden retriever. For the first time in 3 weeks, there was recognition in her eyes, not fear, not emptiness, but genuine interest. Max approached with the measured pace of a trained professional, reading Emma's body language with uncanny precision. He stopped exactly 3 feet away from her, close enough to offer comfort, far enough to avoid triggering her trauma response. Then he did something that made Dr. Chon grab her notepad and start writing furiously. Max lowered himself to the floor and rested his chin on his paws, making himself as non-threatening as possible while maintaining eye contact with Emma. For 20 minutes, girl and dog simply looked at each other. No words were spoken, no sudden movements made. But something profound was happening. A connection was forming that transcended the need for human language. Emma's rigid posture began to relax slightly. Her breathing became less shallow. Most significantly, she extended one small finger toward Max, not quite touching him, but acknowledging his presence. Over the following days, their relationship deepened in ways that amazed the medical staff. Emma began using simple hand gestures to communicate with Max, pointing when she wanted him to come closer, holding up her palm when she needed space. Max responded to each signal with perfect understanding, as if he could read her mind. More remarkably, he began to anticipate Emma's emotional needs, positioning himself between her and the door when she felt threatened. Resting his head on her lap during the worst of her flashbacks, Dr. Chun realized she was witnessing something unprecedented in child psychology. Emma wasn't just bonding with Max, she was developing an entirely new language with him. Within 2 weeks, they had created an intricate system of communication that included hand signals, facial expressions, and subtle body movements. Emma could tell Max when she was scared, sad, angry, or even hungry. Max responded with specific behaviors that let everyone know exactly what Emma needed. It's like they're speaking a language only they understand, Beth Williams observed during one of her training sessions with the pair. Max is becoming Emma's voice when she can't find her own. But the most remarkable discovery came when Dr. Chon noticed Emma whispering to Max during their private moments together. The microphones couldn't pick up what she was saying, but Emma's lips were definitely moving, forming words that she shared only with her canine companion. Max would listen intently, his intelligent brown eyes focused completely on Emma's face, as if every whispered word was precious beyond measure. As Emma's court date approached, Prosecutor Amanda Foster realized they had stumbled upon something that could revolutionize both child trauma treatment and legal proceedings. Emma had found her voice, not in the traditional sense, but in a way that might prove even more powerful. Through Max, this severely traumatized little girl might finally be able to tell the world what she had witnessed on that terrible night. The question was, would a court of law accept testimony delivered through the bond between a child and her dog? Defense attorney Robert Sterling paced his mahogany-paneled office like a caged predator, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished hardwood floors with military precision. The walls around him displayed 20 years of courtroom victories, framed newspaper headlines, proclaiming his ability to get the most dangerous criminals acquitted. Photos of him shaking hands with powerful politicians and celebrities who owed their freedom to his legal brilliance. But this case was different. This case had him genuinely worried for the first time in his career. A therapy dog? Sterling's voice dripped with contempt as he spoke to his private investigator, Danny Reeves, a former LAPD detective who now specialized in digging up dirt on prosecution witnesses. They want to put a trained animal in my courtroom and claim it can somehow communicate with a traumatized child who hasn't spoken in months? It's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. But beneath Sterling's bluster lay a cold, calculating fear. His clients, Marcus Webb, Tony Martinez, and Jay Coleman, were facing life sentences without the possibility of parole. The prosecution's case was strong, built on physical evidence, crime scene analysis, and Detective Rodriguez's partial testimony from his hospital bed. The only weak link was Emma Rodriguez, the 8-year-old witness who couldn't speak. Sterling had built his defense strategy around discrediting her potential testimony, painting her as too traumatized and unreliable to be believed. Now everything had changed. Across town in the district attorney's office, prosecutor Amanda Foster was engaged in her own battle, not just against the defense, but against skeptical colleagues who thought her approach was legal suicide. At 38, Foster had earned her reputation as one of Los Angeles' most tenacious prosecutors, with a conviction rate that made career criminals nervous and defense attorneys respectful. But even her closest allies thought she had lost her mind. "Amanda, you're risking everything on an 8-year-old girl and a dog," warned District Attorney James Morrison during a heated meeting in his corner office. Morrison was a political animal who understood that high-profile losses could end careers, including his own. "Sterling will tear this apart. He'll make you look like a fool in front of the jury, the media, and every legal expert in California." Foster leaned forward in her chair, her green eyes blazing with determination. "Jim, I've spent 3 months with Emma and Dr. Chun. I've seen what this child can communicate through that dog. It's not some parlor trick or emotional manipulation. It's real communication from the only person who witnessed the entire attack. If we don't give Emma a voice, those 3 animals walk free to hurt someone else's family." The legal precedents were virtually non-existent. Foster's research team had scoured law libraries across the country, finding only a handful of cases where therapy animals had been permitted in courtrooms, and none involving facilitated communication with a traumatized witness. They were essentially writing new law, and Sterling knew it. Sterling's strategy was multi-pronged and vicious. First, he filed a motion challenging the dog's presence as prejudicial under California Evidence Code Section 352, arguing that any testimony obtained through an animal would unfairly influence the jury's emotions rather than their judgment. His brief was a masterpiece of legal argumentation, citing everything from biblical law to modern psychology to argue that animal-assisted testimony violated the defendant's right to due process. "Your Honor," Sterling argued during the first pre-trial hearing, his voice resonating through the packed courtroom like a sermon from a corrupt preacher, "we are not living in ancient Egypt where animals were worshipped as gods. This is a court of law, not a circus. My clients have the right to face their accusers, not to be condemned by the barking of a dog." Judge Patricia Williams presided over these hearings with the gravity of someone who understood she was potentially making legal history. At 53, she had been appointed to the bench after a distinguished career as a prosecutor, and had earned respect for her fairness and scholarly approach to complex legal issues. But this case pushed every boundary she had ever encountered. The hearing stretched over 2 weeks, with expert witnesses flown in from across the country. Dr. Ellen Martinez, a Harvard psychiatrist specializing in childhood trauma, testified that Emma's connection with Max represented a breakthrough in understanding how severely traumatized children could communicate. "What we're seeing isn't just therapy," Dr. Martinez explained, her credentials lending weight to every word. "This is a new form of human-animal communication that allows access to memories and experiences that would otherwise remain locked away forever." Sterling countered with his own experts, including Dr. Richard Hoffman, a clinical psychologist from Stanford, who argued that Emma's alleged communication with Max was nothing more than projection and wishful thinking by well-meaning but misguided adults. "Children are highly susceptible to suggestion," Dr. Hoffman testified with academic authority. "What we're seeing is likely the therapeutic team unconsciously coaching this child to respond in ways that confirm their preconceived theories." Behind the scenes, the pressure was enormous. Emma's medical team reported that she was becoming increasingly agitated as the court date approached, experiencing nightmares that left her trembling and refusing to eat. Only Max's presence seemed to calm her, and even then, Dr. Chun worried that forcing Emma to testify might cause permanent psychological damage. The media circus surrounding the case had reached fever pitch. Legal experts debated on cable news shows. Animal rights activists held vigils outside the courthouse, and national magazines ran cover stories about the miracle dog, who might revolutionize justice for traumatized children. The pressure on Judge Williams was immense. Her ruling would be scrutinized by appeals courts, legal scholars, and the international media. Sterling's final gambit was personal and cruel. His investigator had discovered that Dr. Chun had faced professional censure 5 years earlier for using unorthodox treatment methods with an autistic child. Though she had been completely exonerated, Sterling filed a motion to exclude her testimony and disqualify Max based on what he called a pattern of experimental treatments that prioritize publicity over patient welfare. Foster's response was swift and devastating. She produced documentation showing that Dr. Chun's previous case had resulted in a breakthrough treatment now used internationally, and that the professional review had praised her innovative approach. More importantly, she filed countermotions demanding sanctions against Sterling for what she called a deliberate campaign of character assassination, designed to silence a traumatized child. As the final pretrial hearing approached, Judge Williams faced the most difficult decision of her judicial career. She spent sleepless nights reviewing case law, consulting with appellate judges, and wrestling with questions that had never been asked in an American courtroom. Could a dog really serve as a conduit for testimony? Was Emma's communication with Max reliable enough to meet the standards of evidence? Would allowing this unprecedented testimony open the floodgates to frivolous claims and courtroom chaos? The stakes couldn't be higher. 3 dangerous criminals might go free if the testimony was excluded. But if Judge Williams allowed it, and an appeals court overturned the conviction, Emma and her family would have to endure this nightmare all over again. The entire legal system would be watching her decision, waiting to see if justice could evolve to embrace new forms of truth-telling. On the morning of her ruling, Judge Williams entered her courtroom, knowing that whatever she decided would change American jurisprudence forever. The morning air outside the Los Angeles County Superior Court crackled with electricity as hundreds of reporters, legal experts, and curious onlookers formed a chaotic sea of humanity stretching for 3 city blocks. News vans with satellite dishes lined the streets like modern-day cavalry, their crews broadcasting live updates to a nation captivated by the unprecedented legal drama about to unfold. The trial of the century, as CNN had dubbed it, was finally beginning, and the entire world seemed to be watching. Inside Courtroom 237, the atmosphere was so tense it felt like the air itself might shatter. Judge Patricia Williams had made her historic ruling the previous Friday. Emma Rodriguez would be permitted to testify with Max by her side, using their unique form of communication to tell her story. The decision had sent shockwaves through the legal community, with some experts hailing it as a revolutionary advancement in justice for trauma victims, while others condemned it as a dangerous precedent that would undermine the integrity of the American court system. Emma sat in the witness chair, her tiny frame dwarfed by the imposing wooden structure that had been designed for adults. Her dark hair was pulled back in careful braids by her mother, who had spent an hour that morning trying to make everything as normal as possible for her daughter. Emma wore her favorite yellow dress, the one with tiny sunflowers that her grandmother had bought for her 8th birthday, back when birthdays still meant celebration, instead of painful reminders of innocence lost. Beside the witness stand, Max sat with the dignified bearing of a trained professional, his golden coat brushed to perfection, and his intelligent brown eyes alert but calm. He wore a special blue vest, identifying him as a certified facility dog, and around his neck hung a small tag that read, "Working. Dog, do not pet." But there was something in Max's demeanor that went beyond his training, an almost mystical awareness of the moment's importance and his role in delivering justice for the small girl who had become his entire world. The jury box held 12 of Los Angeles County's citizens, carefully selected after 3 grueling days of voir dire questioning. There was Margaret Chun, a retired schoolteacher whose own granddaughter had been a victim of violence. Robert Martinez, a construction foreman who initially expressed skepticism about animal-assisted testimony. Jennifer Walsh, a young mother who had visibly teared up during jury selection when she learned about Emma's trauma. And 9 others, whose faces would soon determine the fate of 3 dangerous men, and set a precedent that would echo through American jurisprudence for decades to come. At the defendant's table, Marcus Webb, Tony Martinez, and Jake Coleman sat in their carefully tailored suits, their lawyers having spent thousands of dollars to make them appear as harmless as possible. Webb's prematurely gray hair had been styled to give him a distinguished appearance, while Martinez's numerous tattoos were hidden beneath long sleeves and high collars. Coleman, the youngest, had been coached to maintain an expression of confused innocence, as if he couldn't possibly understand why he was in this courtroom. But their eyes betrayed their true nature, cold, calculating, and filled with barely contained rage at the child who threatened to destroy their carefully constructed alibis. Defense attorney Robert Sterling prowled behind the defendant's table like a predator preparing to strike, his expensive suit immaculate and his silver hair gleaming under the courtroom's fluorescent lights. In his briefcase lay an arsenal of legal weapons designed to destroy Emma's credibility. Psychiatric reports, expert testimonies about the unreliability of child witnesses, and character assassinations that would paint her as a confused little girl manipulated by overzealous adults desperate for a conviction. Prosecutor Amanda Foster stood at the prosecution table, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. She had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, working with Dr. Chon and Max's trainer to understand every nuance of Emma's communication system. Foster knew that if she failed here, 3 violent criminals would walk free, and the door would be slammed shut on innovative approaches to helping traumatized witnesses find their voices. The gallery was packed with a diverse crowd that represented the broader implications of this case. Victim advocates sat beside child psychologists, animal behavior experts next to constitutional law professors. Maria Rodriguez occupied the front row, her face a mask of controlled emotion as she watched her daughter prepare to relive the worst night of her young life. Detective Miguel Rodriguez sat beside his wife in his wheelchair, his body still healing from the brutal attack, but his spirit unbroken as he prepared to watch his daughter fight for justice. Judge Williams surveyed her courtroom with the gravity of someone who understood she was presiding over a moment that would be studied in law schools for generations. At 53, she had handled thousands of cases, but nothing had prepared her for the weight of this decision. Legal scholars from Harvard, Yale, and Stanford had submitted friend-of-the-court briefs arguing both sides of the issue. The California Supreme Court was undoubtedly preparing to review whatever happened here, and the nation's highest court might ultimately decide whether Emma's testimony would stand. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Judge Williams began, her voice carrying the authority of 2 decades on the bench. "You are about to witness testimony that has never been presented in an American courtroom. I want you to understand that while the method of communication may be unprecedented, your job remains the same, to determine the truth based on the evidence presented to you." She turned to Emma with a gentleness that seemed at odds with her stern judicial demeanor. "Emma, sweetheart, I know this is very scary for you, but I want you to know that you're safe here, and Max is going to help you tell us what happened. There's no rush, and you can take as much time as you need." Prosecutor Foster approached the witness stand slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. She had studied child psychology extensively in preparation for this moment, understanding that Emma's trauma response could be triggered by sudden movements or loud voices. The courtroom fell silent except for the barely audible hum of the air conditioning system and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. "Emma," Foster said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "can you tell Max if you remember the night when the bad men came to your house? The courtroom held its collective breath as every eye focused on the small girl and her canine companion. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she looked at Max, their special bond evident in the way the dog's attention focused completely on her face. Slowly, almost hesitantly, Emma lifted her right hand and made a subtle gesture, a slight movement of her fingers that would have been meaningless to most observers. Max's response was immediate and unmistakable. The golden retriever stood gracefully and placed his left paw gently on Emma's knee, maintaining eye contact with her throughout the movement. It was their signal for yes, developed over months of careful training and emotional bonding. The jury gasped audibly. Several jurors leaned forward in their seats, straining to understand what they had just witnessed. In the gallery, reporters frantically scribbled notes, while sketch artists captured the historic moment with rapid strokes of their pencils. But Sterling was on his feet before the moment could fully sink in, his voice booming with theatrical outrage. "Objection, Your Honor. This is nothing more than a trained circus act designed to manipulate the emotions of the jury. There is no way to verify what this child allegedly communicated to this animal, if anything at all." The battle for Emma's voice and for justice itself had officially begun. Judge Patricia Williams raised her hand to silence the courtroom's eruption following Sterling's explosive objection. The weight of legal history pressed down on her shoulders as she made a decision that would echo through American jurisprudence for decades. "Mr. Sterling, your objection is noted, but overruled. This court has already ruled on the admissibility of this testimony method. You may cross-examine the witness about the reliability of her communication, but you will not interrupt the direct examination." Sterling's face flushed crimson with barely contained rage, but he sat down with the forced composure of a predator, temporarily restrained. He knew his moment would come, and when it did, he would tear apart this charade with surgical precision. Prosecutor Amanda Foster nodded gratefully to Judge Williams and turned back to Emma, who had shrunk deeper into the witness chair during the verbal explosion. Max sensed his young friend's distress and moved closer, his warm presence radiating calm and safety. The golden retriever's training was evident in every movement. He understood that Emma's emotional state was fragile, and his job was to help her feel secure enough to continue. "Emma," Foster continued in her gentlest voice, "you're doing wonderfully. Can you ask Max to help you tell us about the men who came to your house that night?" Emma's small hands trembled as she looked at the three defendants sitting at their table. Even in their expensive suits and carefully groomed appearances, she could see the monsters who had destroyed her family's peaceful world. Her breathing became shallow, and for a moment, Dr. Chun feared they might lose her to a panic attack. But Max moved with the intuition that had made him extraordinary among facility dogs. He positioned himself between Emma and the defendant's table, blocking her view of the men who had traumatized her. With Max's protective presence shielding her, Emma found the courage to continue. She made a series of subtle hand gestures, her fingers moving in patterns that meant nothing to the courtroom observers, but everything to the trained golden retriever watching her intently. Max responded by turning his attention to the defendant's table, his intelligent brown eyes focusing with laser intensity on the three men who had shattered Emma's world. The jury watched in fascination as this unprecedented form of communication unfolded before them. Margaret Chun, the retired schoolteacher, found herself leaning forward, her educator's instincts recognizing authentic communication when she saw it. Robert Martinez, the construction foreman who had initially been skeptical, felt his doubts beginning to crumble as he witnessed the genuine interaction between girl and dog. But it was Emma's next gesture that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. With careful deliberation, Emma pointed directly at Marcus Webb while making a specific hand signal to Max. The response was immediate and chilling. Max let out a low, protective growl that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. a sound that spoke of primal recognition of danger. The golden retriever's hackles raised slightly as he stared at Webb with an intensity that made the defendant visibly uncomfortable. Webb, who had maintained an arrogant smirk throughout most of the proceedings, actually recoiled in his chair. The man who had orchestrated brutal attacks without flinching found himself intimidated by a dog's unwavering stare. His lawyer, noticing his client's reaction, quickly whispered something in Webb's ear, trying to regain composure. "Objection!" Sterling shouted, springing to his feet with renewed fury. "This is nothing but theatrical nonsense. Dogs cannot identify criminal defendants. This entire display is prejudicial grandstanding designed to inflame the jury's emotions." Judge Williams considered the objection carefully. She was walking a legal tightrope, balancing the need to allow Emma's unique testimony against the defendant's rights to a fair trial. "Mr. Sterling, the witness is communicating through established methods that this court has deemed admissible. However, I will instruct the jury that the dog's behavior should be considered only as it relates to the witness's communication, not as independent evidence of guilt." As the legal arguments swirled around her, Emma made a decision that would change everything. She stood up from the witness chair with a determination that surprised everyone, including Dr. Chun, who was watching from the gallery. Max immediately sensed the shift in his young friend's emotional state and moved to stay close beside her. Emma walked slowly across the courtroom, her small yellow dress bright against the dark wood paneling, her eyes never leaving Max's face. The courtroom fell silent as everyone watched this tiny figure take control of her own testimony in a way no one had anticipated. When she reached Max, she knelt down beside him and leaned close to his ear. What happened next would be remembered by every person in that courtroom for the rest of their lives. For the first time in 6 months, Emma Rodriguez spoke aloud. Her voice was barely above a whisper, audible only to Max, and perhaps the court reporter who was straining to capture every sound. But the sight of Emma's lips moving, of actual words being formed after months of silence, created an electric shock that rippled through the gallery. Maria Rodriguez gasped and covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her face as she watched her daughter take her first steps back toward the world of human communication. Max listened to Emma's whispered words with the intense concentration of a trained professional. Whatever she told him caused his entire demeanor to change. His tail stopped wagging, his ears pricked forward, and his intelligent eyes took on a focus that seemed almost supernatural. Then Max did something that stunned even his own trainer. The golden retriever walked directly to the evidence table where the weapons used in the attack on Detective Rodriguez were displayed. Without any command from Emma or signal from the prosecution team, Max sat down beside the baseball bat that Tony Martinez had wielded that terrible night. The dog's behavior was so unexpected, so far beyond his training protocols, that Beth Williams, his handler, stood up in shock from her seat in the gallery. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Jurors gasped, reporters frantically scribbled notes, and the defendants' faces went pale with disbelief. How could this dog possibly know which weapon had been used in the attack? How could Emma have communicated such specific information through whispered words that no human could hear? Sterling was on his feet screaming objections, his carefully constructed composure finally cracking under the weight of what appeared to be impossible evidence. Judge Williams banged her gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order to a courtroom that had just witnessed something that defied logical explanation. But Emma wasn't finished. She walked back to the witness stand with Max beside her, and for the first time since that terrible night 6 months ago, she looked directly at Judge Williams and spoke loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "Max says they're the bad men who hurt my daddy." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, and in that moment, everyone present understood they had just witnessed something that would change the nature of justice forever. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence, so complete that the only sounds were the distant hum of air conditioning and the rapid scratching of court reporters trying to capture every word of this historic moment. Emma's declaration. Max says they're the bad men who hurt my daddy, hung in the air like a bell that couldn't stop ringing. Judge Patricia Williams sat frozen behind her bench, her 20 years of judicial experience providing no roadmap for what she was witnessing. Maria Rodriguez sobbed openly in the gallery, her hands pressed to her mouth as 6 months of anguished hope finally transformed into overwhelming relief. Her little girl was speaking again. The daughter who had retreated into terrified silence was finding her voice, and with it, the strength to confront the monsters who had destroyed their family's peace. Defense attorney Robert Sterling's face had gone ashen, his carefully constructed arrogance replaced by something approaching panic. In 30 years of criminal defense, he had seen witnesses crack under pressure, evidence manufactured by overzealous prosecutors, and juries swayed by emotional manipulation. But this was different. This felt real in a way that made his blood run cold. How could a traumatized child and a therapy dog possibly know details about evidence that even the police had struggled to connect? At the defendant's table, the 3 men who had seemed so confident just hours earlier now looked like cornered animals. Marcus Webb's hands trembled as he whispered frantically to his attorney, his cold blue eyes darting between Emma and the evidence table where Max had somehow identified the exact weapon used in the attack. Tony Martinez wiped sweat from his forehead despite the courtroom's cool temperature, his stocky frame seeming to shrink in his expensive suit. Jake Coleman, the youngest, appeared ready to bolt from the room entirely, his leg bouncing uncontrollably under the table. Prosecutor Amanda Foster felt as if she were standing at the center of a legal earthquake. Nothing in her 15 years of courtroom experience had prepared her for testimony that seemed to transcend the normal boundaries between human and animal communication. She had hoped Emma might be able to identify her attackers through Max, but what was happening exceeded her wildest expectations. "Emma," Foster said gently, approaching the witness stand with careful steps, "can you tell us more about what you saw that night? Can you ask Max to help you remember?" Emma looked down at Max, who sat beside her with the dignified bearing of a guardian angel dressed in golden fur. The connection between them seemed to shimmer with an almost mystical energy as Emma began to communicate through their private language of gestures and whispers. What followed would be remembered as the most extraordinary testimony in American legal history. Through a combination of spoken words and signals to Max, Emma began to paint a detailed picture of that terrible night. Her voice, still fragile, but growing stronger with each revelation, described how she had watched from the top of the stairs as the 3 masked intruders destroyed her family's sanctuary. Max responded to each of Emma's communications with behaviors that seemed to confirm and amplify her testimony. When Emma whispered something about Tony Martinez, Max walked directly to the defendant and sat down, staring at the man with an intensity that made Martinez visibly uncomfortable. The stocky criminal, who had terrorized countless victims without remorse, found himself intimidated by a therapy dog's unwavering gaze. "He had a tattoo," Emma said, her voice growing clearer as her confidence built. "On his neck. It looked like a snake eating its own tail." The courtroom gasped as Martinez instinctively reached up to touch his collar, which had been carefully positioned to hide the exact tattoo Emma described. The prosecution had never photographed that particular marking. It had been concealed during his arrest and booking. Sterling leaped to his feet, desperation creeping into his voice. "Objection! There's no way this child could know about details that weren't in the police reports. This is clearly coaching or manipulation." But Judge Williams was studying Martinez's reaction to Emma's words, and what she saw was the unmistakable body language of guilt. Overruled. The witness may continue. Emma's next revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. "The man with the gray hair," she said, pointing at Marcus Webb. "He said something to my mommy. He said, 'Your husband should have minded his own business.' Then he laughed when she cried." Webb's composure finally cracked completely. His face went white as he realized that Emma had overheard words he thought only his victims could remember. The prosecution had never been able to recover audio from that night, and Webb had been certain that Detective Rodriguez had been too injured to remember specific conversations. Max seemed to sense that Emma was approaching the most difficult part of her testimony. The golden retriever moved closer to her, providing physical comfort as she prepared to relive the worst moments of that night. Emma's voice dropped to a whisper as she described watching her father being beaten with baseball bats, seeing her mother's tears, hearing sounds that no 8-year-old should ever have to remember. But it was Emma's final revelation that changed everything. "Jake was supposed to watch for police cars," Emma said, looking directly at Coleman, who had been presented by his attorneys as a minor participant who barely understood what was happening. "But he came inside and helped them hurt Daddy. He was the one who kicked Daddy in the head when Daddy tried to get up." Coleman's face went ashen. His entire defense strategy had been built on the claim that he was merely a lookout who never entered the house. His lawyers had negotiated a potential plea deal based on his supposed minimal involvement. Now Emma's testimony was revealing him as an active participant in the most vicious moments of the attack. The young criminal couldn't handle the pressure. In front of the entire courtroom, Jake Coleman broke down completely. "She's lying," he screamed, jumping to his feet and pointing at Emma. "She couldn't have seen that. She was supposed to be asleep. How could she know about?" He stopped mid-sentence, realizing he had just confirmed details that only someone present during the attack could know. The courtroom erupted in chaos as Coleman's outburst revealed his guilt to everyone present. His own attorneys looked stricken, realizing their client had just destroyed his defense with his emotional breakdown. Sterling shouted objections, but his voice was lost in the tumult of a courtroom, witnessing a confession in real time. Judge Williams banged her gavel repeatedly, fighting to restore order. But the damage was done. Emma's testimony, delivered through her extraordinary bond with Max, had accomplished what months of police investigation and prosecutorial preparation couldn't achieve. It had broken the defendants' united front and revealed the truth that they had tried so desperately to hide. As order was finally restored, everyone in the courtroom understood they had just witnessed something that would change American justice forever. A traumatized child and her therapy dog had delivered testimony that no jury could ignore, using a form of communication that transcended every legal precedent ever established. The trial was far from over, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The jury deliberation room on the 7th floor of the Los Angeles County Superior Court buzzed with an energy that veteran court officers had never witnessed before. 12 citizens who had entered that room as strangers just hours earlier now sat, united by the extraordinary testimony they had witnessed. Margaret Chun, the retired schoolteacher, spoke first, her voice filled with emotion. "In 40 years of working with children, I've never seen anything like what that little girl just did. She found a way to speak the truth when everyone said it was impossible." Robert Martinez, the construction foreman who had initially been skeptical about the dog's role, shook his head in amazement. "I didn't believe in this animal communication stuff when we started. But what I saw in there, that wasn't some trained trick. That was real communication between that child and her dog. And those men's reactions told us everything we needed to know about their guilt." The deliberation lasted exactly 93 minutes, one of the shortest in Los Angeles County history for a case of such magnitude. When the jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces carried the solemnity of citizens who understood they had participated in something that would echo through American legal history for generations. Foreman David Kim, a software engineer who had been elected by his peers to deliver their verdict, stood with the weight of justice on his shoulders. Judge Patricia Williams called the court to order, and the packed gallery fell silent as the moment of truth arrived. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Williams asked, her voice carrying the authority of 2 decades on the bench. "We have, Your Honor," Kim replied, his voice steady despite the enormity of the moment. "On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree against Detective Miguel Rodriguez, how do you find the defendant Marcus Webb?" "Guilty, Your Honor." The word hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Maria Rodriguez collapsed into her husband's arms, 6 months of anguished hope finally transforming into overwhelming relief. Detective Rodriguez, still confined to his wheelchair, but very much alive, wept openly as justice began to unfold for his family. "On the same charge against Tony Martinez?" "Guilty, Your Honor." "Against Jake Coleman?" "Guilty, Your Honor." The verdicts continued in rapid succession. Guilty on all counts for all 3 defendants. Aggravated burglary, assault with deadly weapons, conspiracy, witness intimidation. The jury had found them responsible for every crime they had committed against the Rodriguez family. As each guilty verdict rang out, the defendants seemed to shrink in their chairs, their arrogance replaced by the stark reality of life sentences, without the possibility of parole. Emma sat in the witness chair throughout the reading of the verdicts, Max beside her providing the steady comfort that had made this moment possible. When the final guilty verdict was announced, she wrapped her arms around the golden retriever's neck and whispered something that only he could hear. Max's tail wagged gently, the first time he had shown such emotion during the entire trial. Defense attorney Robert Sterling sat stunned at his table. His legendary career effectively ended by the testimony of an 8-year-old girl and her therapy dog. 3 decades of courtroom victories meant nothing in the face of this devastating defeat. His clients would spend the rest of their lives in prison, and Sterling would forever be remembered as the lawyer who lost to a child who couldn't speak, until she found her voice through an extraordinary bond with a remarkable animal. Judge Williams addressed the courtroom with the gravity befitting this historic moment. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have witnessed something unprecedented in American jurisprudence today. This court's decision to allow Emma Rodriguez to testify through her communication with Max has resulted in justice for a family that suffered unspeakable trauma. I am submitting a full report to the California Supreme Court, recommending that animal-assisted testimony be considered as a legitimate tool for helping traumatized witnesses, particularly children, find their voices in pursuit of justice." The legal implications rippled outward immediately. Within hours, law schools across the country were incorporating Emma's case into their curricula. The Rodriguez precedent became required reading for prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges dealing with traumatized witnesses. Child advocacy groups hailed the decision as a revolutionary breakthrough that would help countless young victims tell their stories when traditional methods failed. 6 months after the trial, Emma Rodriguez was a different child than the terrified girl who had first entered that courtroom. She spoke freely now, her voice clear and strong, though she still preferred to share her deepest thoughts with Max. The golden retriever had become a permanent member of the Rodriguez family, officially adopted and beloved by everyone who understood his role in their healing journey. Dr. Sarah Chun's innovative approach to trauma therapy became the foundation for a new treatment protocol that was adopted by children's hospitals nationwide. The Chun-Rodriguez method of animal-assisted communication therapy was saving young lives across America, giving voices to children who had been silenced by trauma too severe for traditional treatment methods. Emma's story reached far beyond the legal world. The Oprah Winfrey Show featured her and Max in a special episode about healing from trauma. Publishers competed for the rights to her family's story. Most importantly, the Courthouse Dogs program that had trained Max received unprecedented funding and support, allowing them to train hundreds of facility dogs to help other traumatized witnesses find their voices. But perhaps the most remarkable development came a year after the trial, when Emma announced her own dreams for the future. Standing before a crowd of child advocates, trauma specialists, and legal experts at a conference in her honor, 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez spoke with the confidence of someone who had faced her worst fears and emerged victorious. "I want to help other kids who can't talk because bad things happen to them," she said, her hand resting on Max's head as he sat proudly beside her. "Max taught me that there are lots of ways to speak the truth. Sometimes you use words, sometimes you use your hands, and sometimes you use your heart. But the truth always finds a way to come out if you're brave enough to try." Audience gave her a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes, but Emma was already looking ahead to her next mission. She was working with Dr. Chun to develop a program that would teach other children to communicate with therapy dogs, expanding the network of healing that had begun with her own journey from silence to voice. Marcus Webb, Tony Martinez, and Jake Coleman would spend the rest of their lives in maximum security prisons, their appeals repeatedly denied by courts that recognized the validity of Emma's extraordinary testimony. But their legacy was overshadowed by the positive changes their crimes had inadvertently sparked, a revolution in how America's justice system serves its most vulnerable witnesses. Emma Rodriguez had entered that courtroom as a silent victim. She left as a powerful advocate whose voice would echo through the halls of justice for generations to come, proving that sometimes the smallest voices can create the biggest changes in the world.